All right, so now we're going to get to section 2, talking about the unification of Egypt and the early political history, and ultimately we're going to get to Egypt's second coolest monuments, the pyramids. Yes, I said the second. But first we're going to get to the unification of Egypt, and you need to understand two very broad terms for quiz and test purposes. You have Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Now, this does get a little confusing sometimes for some because it's easy to get mixed up. Lower Egypt, it's actually in reference to the Nile River. And so Lower Egypt, the Nile River starts up here or down here, however you want to really kind of think of it. But the Nile River flows towards the Mediterranean Sea, okay? And so what you actually have is Upper Egypt refers to this portion of the river, the southern portion, and Lower Egypt refers to the northern portion of the river. All right, so when we talk about Egyptian history, scholars organize it into various periods and dynasties. These periods are based off the work of an Egyptian priest living during the era when Greeks controlled Egypt under the Ptolemaic dynasty all the way back in 300 BC. He goes around and he tries to understand Egyptian monuments, and he comes up with 30 different dynasties that we will use for quite a bit. And during the next couple lectures, we'll use those numbers that this man, Menetho, came up with. And the first dynasty really begins with this man named Menes. And who united Upper and Lower Egypt, became a dual king. In other words, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, and united all of Egypt. And he tells us about this on this column, right? The Narmer palette, where he's actually going off to war. He's actually won the battle. I should say he's got this mace here in his hand, and he's getting ready to bash in the head of his enemy. And they've actually, over here, they've killed a bunch of enemies already. And so it's just telling us that there was a battle, and we can piece together from other sources that he does, in fact, unite Egypt for the first time. His name is Menes. And you need to know that. It takes place right around 3000, and this dynasty goes from about 3000 to 1100 BC. It's very difficult to get the dates exact that far back. So just know the big picture here, but know that Menes is important, and what we will end up doing with Egyptian scholarship in throughout history, because it really started with him about 3,000 years ago. Then take those dynasties and then we place them into the bigger picture scheme. So we have pre-dynastic, we have early dynasty, we have the old kingdom, the intermediate or the middle kingdom, and the new kingdom. So you kind of get the point. You have a kingdom, it's kind of like a roller coaster. The kingdom is Egypt. During its heightened power. Then it declines a bit. Political unity dissipates. You get right? Then you have the intermediate, and the roller coaster goes back up, right, to the middle kingdom. And then we have another kind of roller coaster ride, and then it goes back up and starts the new kingdom. And then we have a new roller coaster ride. And so you have these phases of life throughout Egyptians. So let's talk about kingship now. Why kingship? What is it about kingship that's so appealing to ancient people? And how does this diverge? I mean, it's hereditary, right? It's typically male, but why? We talked about the Sumerians had kind of started this assembly idea. But I think that the assemblies eventually lead to kings, right? You need somebody to really step up and lead the assembly. That person typically ends up becoming the king. And it's usually a combination of personality and power. And at some point, someone eventually comes to the forefront to lead, especially if you're going to go off to war and so you end up with these accomplished warriors. And it's not hard to imagine that that's who ends up coming forward to kind of be the leader. And to a lot of people, they become very powerful, and eventually that turns into a king. And sort of that person tends to have a lot of charisma and be worthy of following. Before we have civilization, right, with nomads and wanderers and hunters and gatherers, they have chieftains and leaders, but not really to this scale. As kingship emerges, it really has this role that goes along with the military and religion, this idea that you're in charge of all of it, right? And you're responsible for all of it. And that's very true of each of the ancient regions that we're talking about. Now, in Egypt, the king, remember, he has to uphold Ma'at. He's the mediator between God and men. The king in Egypt is often deified. In this scene, right, we have Amun-Ra here and Pharaoh who is bringing him before the god. A seated Ma'at figure, right? No feather right here, but you know from the last lecture, quite literally, he's going before Amun-Ra to be tested, right? And he says, hey, Amun-Ra, you're the head of the pantheon, chief of gods. Look, I upheld my heart during my reign and during my life. I'm offering you truth, order, and justice. I'm a good pharaoh who kept all of these things. I kept Ma'at. And so it's again, very important as a concept to guide and to bind the gods to society and not allow them to have more power than they should. They're already pretty powerful, right? As much as any human being ever, especially during the kingdom phase that we kind of just talked about. But it's an important check on that power, and they often are deified, especially at death. There were many of them, and they have mortuary temples, and we call it where it's kind of this cult of personality around them. They have statues, of course, throughout the land, like a good pious son of a pharaoh. The next pharaoh is supposed to venerate his father and his legacy, his memory, and keep it intact. And part of this very much becomes a worship of those past pharaohs. So this is different, though, right? It is different than Mesopotamia. And there are other expectations of kings. Of course, they're warriors. That goes without saying. And I think it's pretty obvious that they're supposed to, display their wealth, right? They're warrior kings, but they're also supposed to be wealthy and show off in a grandiose fashion, right? You have these very, very over-the-top, luxurious items that we find in all of the tombs, especially like King Tut's tomb, right? And we'll talk about him in the final section of this module. And he's a new kingdom pharaoh, but these aren't. It's kind of absurd how much wealth some of these pharaohs kind of had, right? You look at this chair, right? This is wood, which is kind of rare in Egypt. There's not a whole lot of trees, so they had to import it. Then it's gilded, which it's like they took gold foil and laid it on top, and you would stamp it down. It took a very, very advanced craftsman to make it like this so that there was no wrinkles or anything like that. It's exquisitely worked. Then you have all these turquoise gems and lapis lazuli, which is the blue. And so this is, is worth a fortune. I mean, everything on this slide is really incredibly valuable. And that's really just what it's made out of. It doesn't even take into account the historical significance. And so it's really incredible. So on the right, you have this statue / coffin lid here, and it's showing you the crook and flail, and kind of shows the role that the Egyptian pharaohs play. They have a staff to guide and lead and direct the sheep, and they use the shepherd imagery just like the Bible does. Let the good ruler, a good ruler is a shepherd for his people. It's not to say that people are dumb, but that a ruler guides them, right? And then you have the flail for when they get out of line, when they have to be disciplinarians and when people need to be punished. So that's the care and the sort of power that the king has. And again, this is gold, and it shows the wealth here. It's staggering. And this is a conspicuous consumption, right? Like, I mean, it's obvious that we are boisterous and visible and obvious to the people, right? Like, we are rich and we are blessed. And so even this stuff was found in a tomb, the throne he probably used, which was like symbolic of what he actually had, not even to take into account. I mean, it was symbolic. I mean, it was gilded. It was covered in gold. His actual tomb, his actual seat, throne was probably solid gold. Pyramids are another example of this, of course, and what an incredible waste of resources to bury a person. I mean, if you think about it. But as I mentioned, there were the males were normally king, but occasionally you do get a female ruler, like Hatshepsut. I know I was kind of stumbling over my words because I was thinking of this woman's name, Hatshepsut. And it's definitely she's most famous of Egyptian female pharaohs until you get to Cleopatra, which is really Greek, or at least half Greek. It's very strange, the Egyptian mindset, because pharaohs were supposed to be male and kings have been for a long time. Rulers in general are male in the ancient world, but there's obviously some exceptions here and there. But Hatshepsut has to deal with this. So on the one hand, she sometimes, presents herself as a woman, like on the left, but this is kind of unnatural. So sometimes she's still part of the male-dominated role, like in military roles. And now, I don't think she actually goes to war, but she has to depict herself in keeping with Egyptian thought and the ideology and how they believe about these things. So sometimes she puts herself as a male. It's not because she's the first cross-dresser in human history, but it's because she has to fulfill these roles that are typically filled by men. She wants to show herself in some cases as being just as capable. Other expectations for kings are, of course, to be the military protector. We talked about that, and that was beyond obvious. They're the chief judge if the cases can't be settled by the lower magistrates, and there are thousands and thousands of magistrates and bureaucrats in ancient Egypt because they basically invented government bureaucracy. There are, of course, setting the agenda for economics and taxes and delegating almost all of this. And they are also the chief priests. So there's chief priests of each local cult, but Pharaoh is himself basically a chief priest, sort of the whole land. So it's a pretty cushy gig in terms of life expectancy compared to most of the things going on and people that are living, because no, he doesn't have to run around and get food or anything like that. But there's also an enormous amount of pressure at the same time. I mean, anyone given the option in the ancient world would say, it would be great to be a pharaoh, but look at the Nile, right? Is it flooding like it's supposed to be? If not, who are they going to blame? Pharaoh, because the river's not flooding, right? Which, of course, we know that's a scientific thing. Has nothing to do with the Pharaoh, but they're going to blame him anyways. Why are the gods mad at you? Are you not upholding Ma'at because the river's not flooding and you're Pharaoh and you're the kind of intermediary between us? So there was a lot of pressure on them, right? Great gig, don't get me wrong, tons of power, but an awful lot of responsibility, and it's something that no single person should really be responsible for. Now, if you want to compare that for a second to kingship in early Mesopotamia, those kings are not gods. Remember, we said that their word was Lugal, or the big man, which we talked about in the first lecture. They were really started out as priests, right? So these guys are just priest kings and then warrior kings and then just kings, right? But they start out as chief priests. And even though they're chief priests, when they die, they're not deified like the Egyptians are. In fact, we actually saw in Mesopotamia, there is a guy named Naram Sin, which is funny because at the end, they're basically saying, hey, this guy is sinning by trying to do this, essentially. But he tries to kind of deify himself through his leadership, right? And there's this picture, right? He's defeated people, and now he's kind of stacking up their bodies and standing on them, trying to get up here to the top of the mountain where he can be with the gods. And ultimately, they overthrow him, right? And they tear him down and they say, you're not a god. But in Egypt, it's kind of the opposite, right? Where you can have this kind of demigod idea. And so that's definitely one major difference between the way Egyptians and Mesopotamians saw their leaders. Another is that really exemplifies a major difference is the pyramids, right? Monumental construction on the scale of the pyramids can only happen when a king has supreme power beyond our ability to even imagine it. But thankfully for Egypt, he has all that power, but he has to uphold Ma'at, so it kind of keeps them in line. Now remember, important thing, pyramids are tombs. Okay, fundamentally different from the Mesopotamian ziggurat. Ziggurats are temples. Pyramids are tombs, which, has a much more healthy function. Which one has a more healthy function for society? Obviously, temples probably, right? Like, tombs are not very valuable to civilization. They're not functional, not saying they're not important, but come on, all the world over, you have different burial rites and different customs, but they kind of took it to the extreme here. So as we move into this time talking about the pyramids, we're actually kind of, we need to see where they kind of started, which was this idea of they buried the wealthy on these mastaba bench. It's called a mastaba bench, which is basically like these rectangular, platforms, right? And common people, they just kind of threw them in a hole in the ground, right? And there's nothing fancy about it. But the very rich ended up in these mastaba benches. And if you take enough of these and you make them one next to another, and then you start to connect them, what you end up with is a big, giant rectangular base, right? And then once you start stacking them, you end up with a stepped pyramid, right? Like this one, the stepped pyramid of Djoser. And this was during the third dynasty, and the Old Kingdom, basically, it runs from dynasties 3 through 6, and the pyramids themselves are built during most of those, especially the big ones, they're built during dynasty 3 and 4. But these early ones are really just stacked, huge stacked mastaba benches. And they're stacked right on top of each other. It looks like a giant desert rock cake made out of sand and sandstone and limestone, right? And this is designed by a man named Imhotep, who is actually later deified by the Egyptians because, he came up with this idea. And they say, hey, we're going to worship this guy. He is the god of architects, right, basically. And they deify him. And it's just to recognize his achievement of how great it actually was, that they built this cult around him, essentially. And even built like a whole sacrificial apparatus in Imhotep's memory. But here's the real question. Is this a pyramid? In terms of geometry, no, right? This is basically just a series of smaller and smaller, while still being huge, rectangles stacked on top of each other. So there is a transitional phase between the step pyramids and what we end up with in Giza. So we try and look at it, right? So this one here, far off, this is a pyramid of most likely Senefru, or either Huni or his son Snefru. This is the 4th dynasty now, so you're into the 4th dynasty. We're talking about from like 2600 to early 2500 BC. It's incredibly old, right? So this is like 4,600 years old, and it's eroded quite a bit, and there's a lot of powdery sand and limestone dust down here at the bottom of it. And you can kind of see the transition that you have here, these smooth edges, that they start kind of figuring out how to do the whole pyramid thing, and then they get to the top and they're like, let's just step it up from here, right? So you have a much taller part, and then they realize, like, this is not going to work. We're building this too steep, so then they just put the little steps on the intermediate part right there, right? And they think that this is probably for Seneferu's dad, that he probably built this for his dad, and then he tried to improve it again for himself, right? And if you look, it's like, we thought we had it down, but now we kind of messed up, because it's kind of pretty funny. It has character, right? It's probably one of my favorite pyramids ever, because you know someone had a really bad day when they went to Pharaoh and they were like, sir, we have a problem. We were building the pyramid, but I think we got the angle off at the base, which means it's going to be too tall and it's going to be way too heavy, so we're not going to be able to fix it. So we're just going to adjust, right? So don't take my head off or anything. You know, we've got thousands of people working on it. We're going to fix it. You know, we just got to change the angle a little bit. So it's called the Bent Pyramid of Seneferu. And again, it's kind of funny to look at how it kind of, you could see they were just kind of working it out, right? Like you're here, and then you're here, and then now we're getting close, but we didn't really think it all the way through, but we're going to get it right next time, sir. Sorry about that, right? And it's really incredible. These would have been brilliantly polished, with a small triangle at the top of it, so that it would have caught the sunlight and you could see it from miles and miles away. They're actually oriented to go along with the winter and summer solstice, so that when the sun hits on those days, like June 21st, the pyramids can be visible from other pyramids. So they actually worked with astronomy too, and it's really remarkable. The construction is not just the geometry of building it with ancient materials, but it's the fact that they were using the cycle of the seasons and the Earth's movement, and not even knowing that the Earth was moving, never mind, like much less the sun's movement. And they did all of this so that the pyramids could be more visible from other pyramids at certain times of the year, which is ridiculously impressive. But it's still kind of the second coolest thing in Egypt. Now, the next pyramid that we're looking at here is the Red Pyramid. And now we have a true pyramid, right? We have a real deal. They done figured it all out. It's a pyramid. But it ain't a giant pyramid, right? And once you perfect the shape and the design, now you can just make it bigger. And that's what we get with the big pyramids of Giza. And these are built by Khufu and Khafre. The smaller ones are for their wives. Khufu is the one who builds the largest. And he's also he's kind of famous among Egyptologists, because not only did he build the biggest pyramid, the Giza pyramid, that was just basically built for him as his tomb, he also has the smallest statue ever discovered in Egypt, which is about like very, very tiny. And so it's kind of funny that you have the biggest pyramid, and then when it comes to your likeness, we have the smallest likeness. And so these were used for kind of magical purposes more than anything else, so it wasn't like, it didn't matter that it was big. But it's also very funny that you have this big giant spectacle of a tomb and then the little tiniest statue. What's truly impressive about the pyramids, beyond what we've already talked about, is constructing them, keeping in mind that what's inside, and making sure the whole thing doesn't collapse where you're going to bury the king, right? If you desecrate the king's body and the whole thing collapses, well, that's kind of the worst possible blasphemy you can imagine. So Khufu, for example, we have a fake passage that goes all the way down in this subterranean chamber, and there's nothing there. It's a dead end, a trick. The real passage was actually blocked by this big, giant granite block. It was like a plug to keep people from looting it, and they got looted anyways, but because later, I'm guessing later pharaohs or, people that really were taking their time went in and actually looted the pharaoh's tombs themselves, because the fact that it was blocked off, it would have been incredible. An incredible amount of work to try and unblock it. It wouldn't have been, just some thieves going in, a bunch of robbers trying to get it out. It would have taken time. It would have taken a lot of effort and a major endeavor to try and chip away at that granite plug. And so that plug would have kept you from being able to get to the queen's chamber and the king's chamber. And these passageways are very, very small. They are not built for big people at all. The Egyptians at that time were much shorter, mostly because of nutritional issues. But they were used to be, these passageways were meant to be, used once or twice. Also at Giza, you have the Sphinx of Khafre, who is his son. He's there as a lion with a human head, and it kind of, he's laying down like a good boy, protecting the pyramids, not to ward off people, but to ward off demons, right? And protecting them, these hostile spirits, right, from getting to the pyramids. And of course, like any good commercial company, Pizza Hut built a store right across from the pyramids, which is hilarious to me. The idea that this is like a park area. You can't build any closer. So as close as they possibly could put it, commercialism. I love it. So it's just kind of funny. The Old Kingdom has 2 more dynasties, but we don't get as much power as the 4th dynasty, the guys who build the big pyramids, and many scholars speculate the reason for that is the pyramids are just a big waste of resources. When you think about something this large, times 3 in one site, plus a bunch of smaller ones at that site and smaller ones elsewhere. I mean, how much labor can you really devote to this? It's important to understand, though, that these were not built by slaves, okay? They were built by farmers who rotated out seasonally and weekly, and they would go from farming to building, from farming to building, to farming to building. And we have documents that talk about, this guy wrote down like, hey, it's my turn to go help at the pyramids, but I really just want to keep on farming. Could you go for me, please? And people would like take their place in construction and stuff like that. And I'm sure a lot of people died doing it, but it's not slave labor, right? It's grueling labor. They used earth ramps. They would ship the stone along the Nile, drag them on these wooden rollers, put them in place using this very complex system of ramps and even like pulleys. Not a crane, they didn't have cranes by then, but they had pulley systems to leverage it, and obviously they were brilliant builders and very brilliant with the geometry to be able to do this. But it's not built by the Hebrews, right? It's not built during the Exodus. It's actually 1,000 years before the Exodus, right? So you're talking about these are very, very, very old things. And so what else other than the drain of resources by the pyramids, we shouldn't expect just a collapse or an intermediate period to follow. But that's what happened, right? And so some people say the pyramids were part of that. There's evidence of a drought, though, during the next era. And like I said, there are occasional times where Egypt deals with this, and somehow Pharaoh loses some of his power during that time, and we enter the first intermediate period. We don't have time to talk about all of those, but basically, Pharaoh rises up in Thebes and they reunite Egypt and they start the Middle Kingdom, basically 500 years after the pyramid. So this is an empire that runs about 400 years, or a kingdom. They replace the pyramids with rock-cut tombs. They stop building pyramids. They learn that maybe they are not the best idea, and maybe the tombs are just a better way of doing things. So you end up with the Valley of the Kings, just west of Thebes. They are beautifully decorated, splendidly colorful, and the kings would be buried out there instead. So we talk about the new kingdom pharaohs like Tut and Ramses the Great. They don't have pyramids because by that time the Egyptians are saying pyramids are not worth it. They're too expensive, they're too hard to build, and there's definitely some wisdom there. And so instead they start building these little tombs, okay? And the Middle Kingdom is also the high point of Egyptian literature and art specialists in Egyptology. The art in the Middle Kingdom is actually the most, perfectly symmetrical, and it's sort of the most well done, and it's this sort of renaissance, if you want to put it that way. And there's a lot to cover there, and so we will get to that in section 3.